Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Not feedbacking in a bad way? So, my name is Juan Parra Cancino, and I want to start by thanking Christoph Felix and Arabella Parr, who's my colleague at the Orpheus Institute, who kind of build a very strange bridge for me to be able to test some of the things that are not completely unrelated to Reinberger's experimental systems when it comes to questioning the notion of interpretation from the perspective of the electronic practitioner with Harald Bode as the musical material. So this presentation is a little bit of an open in the kitchen in a good way, in an interesting way, I hope, for some work that I've been doing for the past few years with this idea of trying to understand the notion of interpretation from electronic music and repertoire that doesn't really seem to need interpretation. So this is a little bit the very hopeful map. Of course, I will skim through things, and halfway through, someone will tell me that it's too late, but bear with me. The idea of interpretation in electronic music started from frustration. Like all good ideas come from frustrations. So I was a composer and a guitar player, and I was very interested in electronic music as an aesthetic more than traditional guitar repertoire, which led me to move to Holland and study at the Institute of Sonology. And after 2 years of me working mostly on versions for guitar and electronics of pieces like Spiral by Stockhausen and other open form works, someone stopped me and said, well, you came here, we are not guitar teachers, so you will be good for us to know what you're able to do without that instrument, covering what your potentials. So that started a long trajectory of me trying to deal with this apparatus as if they were the guitar, in terms of the immediacy of musical expression. On one end, on the more, let's say, physical aspect. And on the other end, from a, let's say, music practitioner perspective, this idea of exchanging with composers creative ideas that produce something that is bigger than one single mind trying to produce the work. Let's say, a fancy version of saying, I like to put my talents at the service of others, not necessarily just play my own music. And that, when it comes to electronic media, is very underdeveloped. And there are many reasons for it: the lack of standardization of the media, the fact that we're all struggling with understanding what our instruments are until the day of the performance itself. So it's rare to find electronic music practitioners that take as, let's say, as their main source of inspiration the creative endeavors of others. And in that aspect, I think that symposiums like this, although Harald Bode is not necessarily praised as a compositional figure, it does represent an important creative figure in the history of electronic music, and the way this symposium is trying to combine, let's say, musicological and archival research with the musical experimentation, I think that is extremely valuable. Some of the ideas that I developed during my PhD work had to do with how to negotiate this idea of the interpreter of electronic media from different perspectives. These different perspectives constitute what I understand as musicianship in electronic media. There's this idea that an electronic music practitioner, perhaps more so than a traditional instrumentalist, and pianists and others are welcome to start shouting at me, do need to have an understanding of how the instrument works, much more so than other instrumentalists, to the point of actually being digital luthiers themselves. A lot of electronic music practitioners do build their own instruments, their own models, their own. Of course, even with an interpretative perspective, we are confronted with having to take decisions that are more connected to compositional decisions. So the materials are normally either very closed or very open. So you have to make choices that are more akin to the decisions that a composer makes. And the third aspect is the idea of the performance. So whether you like it or not, being forced to create a custom version that runs in a custom instrument leaves you pretty much as the only expert on that instrument to be on stage presenting these things. So these three roles, in a way, inform different approaches that I take for the interpretation of electronic music works. You can read a lot more about that on my thesis and in other articles, and I won't bother you with that. And since time is at an essence, I just want to bring to you a very short example, that an exemplary moment of what I'm trying to say when it comes to these problems that we face when reconstructing and interpreting pre-existing electronic music, especially ones where the materials maybe are obsolete. So what you see here are two versions of a setup for the performance of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's solo. The one on the top is closer to the original, not really, but let's say it's something that during the 70s was used quite often for live performances of the piece. The piece is originally for a solo melodic instrument and a tape loop system, a feedback system with tape. It was constructed for 3 operators to be helping with the feeding of the signal of the melodic instrument into the feedback system, the repetitions or the feedback inside of the system, and then the projection over 4 loudspeakers. What you see at the bottom is what is possible these days, which is the reduction of all these technical apparatus and the role of these 3 technicians into presets that run on your phone. I'm not going to say anything too bad about it. I think that the over-democratization of technology has democratization in the world, and I think that is a fantastic world that we live in. But from a purely, let's say, aesthetic, musical, Oeuvrian research perspective, the solution at the bottom kills any possibility of risk-taking, choice-making, and anything that makes this piece from 1965 useful to keep around in 2025. So that was my problem. My problem is what happens when we update this technology that is inherent to the work and inherent to what makes that work interesting. When is too much too much? So I go back to the sources, and that's a little bit what drove me to the way we're working with Bode in this symposium, is that there is an interest in going back to the sources, and I was part of a research project of the European Research Council for 5 years that dealt with that breaking, let's say, going beyond traditional interpretation and trying to find ways where every aspect, every element in the world that is associated to a particular piece of music is valid material to be integrated into a performance. In that context, I went to the first recording, the first commercial recording, that is after having a conversation with Vinko Globokar, who is the trombone player that performs in that recording, because I had a problem with the piece as it stands. The piece was aimed to basically create a complex of sounds from a single melodic instrument, in the same way that Stockhausen worked in the studio with using sine waves and overlapping sine waves to create complex timbres. Now, it doesn't take a genius tonmeister to realize that a melodic instrument, as simple as it is way more complex than a sine wave. So when you want to create complexity by overlapping, you create distortion. You don't create new chords. That was my argument. So I went back and I said, well, how did they solve this in the original recording? So we'll just hear it for you. Yeah, I'll just play it for you, and someone, I don't see him anymore, but someone already identified the trick. So far, this is a very plausible version of the piece. We hear trombone, and the trombone transposed and repeated, so that's what we will expect the system to do, and that's fine. That's not trombone-like anymore. So I think that this is enough to make the point. So in that section where there was supposed to be a bigger polyphony, the solution of Stockhausen was to incorporate recordings of other pieces by him, like Hymnen and Telemusik. Kurzweilen. What am I thinking of Telemusik? Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that it took me 15 years after finding this out to finally get a hold of a recording done in Osaka in 1964, because this piece was commissioned by NHK and led, now since we are here with gear buffs, led to the creation of the first 5-track tape recorder ever. And then the Telemusik and this piece was meant to be in 5 channels. And then when Stockhausen brought back his materials to Cologne and the WDR said, 4 is enough, then the history was changed and they became quad pieces. But there are 5-channel recordings of these pieces, and the one that I got access to has distortion in this particular section rather than the addition or the solution by Stockhausen. Stockhausen did other things, another sanctioned version of this work with Michael Vetter, if I'm pronouncing the name right, a recorder player and singer, has the use of one of the first automatized digital mixing desks. So they recorded several versions, and then they use the automatization to reproduce the movements of the tape very accurately, so they could stack things up in the studio afterwards, but never in performance. All this is to say that I'm very much fascinated by this idea that electronic music, and in particular tape music, has one final version, and that's what it is. The transition from ideas to score, to work in the studio, to the final presentation, always will be mediated by people and by tools. And in that sense, having a strong tradition of interpretation and reproduction and performance of the historical repertoire is very important. And that's, I guess, the main point that I try to do in any presentation that I've been doing for the last 15 years. Now, moving on quickly, this is just passing through other projects that I have been working on with this same perspective of the lack of transparency of the media as a positive and as something to embrace as part of the reproduction of work. This is done using as source Bruno Maderna's Hyperion. I have another project done with the music of Luigi Nono. But all this led to the creation of 2 concepts. One is the idea of opaque technologies as opposition to transparent technologies. This is to say that every aspect, every technological aspect that you use in the reconstruction of a particular piece should contribute, even if it's meant to be invisible, like these microphones and the loudspeakers that we're using. Or if not a constant contribution, at least the practitioner should be aware of the potential impact that changes in these invisible elements of technology should have. We all know very well that you shouldn't update your favorite music-making software the day before the performance, for example. And that's not what the vendors should suggest you to do. You should be always up to date. One of the things that became very relevant with this idea of the lack of transparency of technology that should be transparent is, during the pandemic, of course, the use of telematics and the pushing of the limits of what could be done while we were locked in our little caves trying to pretend that the life could go on as normal. I have been working with telematic and network technology since 2005 or 6, when I was invited to be the European guinea pig for a project at Stanford that was developing something that became Jacktrip, which is a very low latency audio protocol that is very stable. During the time of the pandemic, a lot of the experimental use of telematic technology for experimental music kind of stopped, and everyone that was a bit tech savvy had to help your colleagues. At least that was my case. I was part of 3 task forces that offered guidance daily for a year to help people play their string quartets or keep their lessons and keep a little bit of sanity during the period. Now, I was able to troubleshoot a lot of technologies, including the codecs that were being used by Zoom at the moment, in order to both teach people what to avoid, but at the same time give some guidance to the people developing these technologies in terms of what could be improved incrementally to take things to a level where music could be made again. Now, when COVID stopped, suddenly the interest for my work also stopped, which is fine, because then I could do my things again. And that led to my punk response to not being needed anymore, and it's called the Artifacts of Not Here, and that is a project that basically uses every little trick that I learned that you should avoid when playing over the internet as the basic sound material for musicians and for the manipulation of the network. But that's just one example. Why am I saying all these things, and how does it relate to Bode? Well, the way I present my work, regardless of what the subject matter is very influenced by the work of Philip Eger, who is a philosopher of science, not unlike Reinberger, but he's missing in action, so we let him be. But he was very much busy with the starting of, with studying the human dynamics in the first laboratories of artificial intelligence in California. And what he noticed is that this idea, for many reasons, institutional reasons, financial funding pressure, of creating a very interesting hypothesis and then throwing a black box and then having a nice gizmo that validates the hypothesis, had become the norm. And there was less information and less knowledge available when you just show an idea and then the implementation of an idea without exposing what happens in between. So at the Orpheus Institute and at my research group that is called Music, Thought, and Technology, we take this idea of critical technical practice as a way of articulating the importance to share that what's the contents of that black box, what are the processes that lead towards the decision-making of when working in making a new piece, on preparing a new performance, in studying a new repertoire. That leads to finding sources and focusing on elements. In my case, I very much feel an aesthetic resonance with things from the 50s and the 60s more than the current stuff. I think that I'm nostalgic at heart, and it's not for no reason. I do believe that in the history of, let's say, Western European music and how that influenced the musical aesthetics that I feel close to, the latest moment of true revolution happened when composers felt the need to run away from aesthetics that could be easily labeled for political reasons, for propaganda, and at the same time that sometimes pushed them far away enough that they had to reconciliate and try to reinvent their relationship with objects that were not meant to make music and claim them as their instruments. And that's what was happening for my money in the early electronic music studios in Germany, in Italy, in France. And so I think that that was the last big moment where music was truly challenging, because it was challenging for the makers, challenging for the aesthetics, and certainly challenging for the listeners. Even the democratization of technology, as in computers being fast enough to do all those things that could only be in the studio in real time, meant that suddenly the music for X and computer became the norm. So then suddenly we had the violin player again being the musician, and the composer and music technologists pushed further back again off the stage. So to me, this is a very important moment in time, and that's what I try to bring into the live performance setting. What happened in the studios in terms of appropriation of tools that were not meant to be used by making music. And more importantly, and this is where I bring my connection, personal connection to the figure of Harald Bode, is how relevant the technicians that were part of the furniture of the studio were to the shaping of the musical aesthetic of the time. Let's say that there are exceptions like Nono with Milano or Freiburg or Stockhausen in Cologne, but most of the composers that were producing music at the time in those places didn't have a lot of weeks, months to get familiar with it. So there was one person in there that knew exactly how to operate with these tools. And like cinematographers, like you know the story that there's Ingmar Bergman and Godard shared cinematographers for a little while, and that gave birth to one of the period of films of those two filmmakers where they were very praised by things that were not narrative, that were cinematographic. In that particular case, I am a little bit in a quest of revalidating the role of people that some of them went on to become well-renowned composers in their own sake, like Gottfried Michael Koenig or Elian Radig, but also figures that are better known only for the technological contributions, like Marino Zucccheri or Harald Bode. And I'm very honestly curious to see what is there in the music that they made that can inform better what we know and praise of these figures. And that's why I focus first on early electronic music repertoire, and then in figures that perhaps are not the classical figures of electronic music as composers. So in the case of Harald Bode, and I'm just going to check the time, I'm still okay. The questions for me were, what is special and unique in the music that there was very limited access that I had to the music at the beginning, but there were things that were calling me. Was it the spontaneity of it? That I could hear things that I identify in other cases that I had studied in the past in terms of hearing hands on the knob turning, and that staying in the recordings that there were presented as pieces. So what was it there? And what is transformed when we change the materials used to expose the work? So what if we bring that physicality that I hear back on stage? What happened to that music? Does it gain more intensity? So I take this idea of interpretation as a time machine, and I chose my case of exploration, phase 6. The first problem that I had is that I didn't have a date to punch in the time machine. I put there 1976, and it's no more than an educated guess, because we spent with Felix and Arabella, we spent a full day here going through all sorts of boxes and documents of all kinds, trying to find first what material was there written by Bode about his own music, what documents were there commenting on his own music, and then the recordings. And for phase 6, there was no real information in terms of the actual date. Here's a picture of what later became kind of, it never collapsed because Felix is very responsible. If anyone in the administration is, we didn't break anything. Everything went back to the boxes. But here are some of the documents that we identified, some descriptions of what an electronic studio should have, what will be the ideal music synthesizer, but also the proposals that Bode did for funding for his own musical endeavors. And what was interesting is that what he sent as representative of his music was not necessarily with the intentions in terms of aesthetics that he was describing in his plans. His plans were very much connected to the potential of the tools that he knew how to develop. But his work as a composer was mostly commercial, no jingles, and so there was an aesthetic dissonance that I found very fascinating. Kevin Austin, in the publication that you were curating, no? Yeah. So I had some correspondence with Kevin Austin, trying to see whether when he digitized the pieces, he remembered whether they were mono, 2 tracks, multi-tracks. If this particular piece was, he didn't remember much about it, but he had written for each one of the pieces that he digitized a little bit of an explanation. That is, he didn't even know what tools were really used. He went by what he heard and what he knew of the tools. And then I started looking, and after we came to the, this was very interesting. I found in YouTube this video, and then I saw that the video was part of the presentation of the whole project of Bode. And I started contacting who could have it, and then you guys had the whole video. So I'll just play for you a little bit of this. So this is the, come on. It says pause. Okay, does it work? Doesn't work. I apologize. Yeah, now it's working. Yes. So this is phase 6. I won't play the whole thing for you, but it's just to give you an idea of the opening. So you can hear already there's 2 main layers. There's the rhythmic ostinato, and then there's these 3 melodic lines. And this is just based on what the description that he had, of Kevin Austin had, of what he heard, trying to describe this. Anyway, this opening was enough for me to say, yeah, this is it. This is what I want to do. And I started doing the same that I've done with the work by Jaap Vink and Elian Radic, which is first do a voice separation to try to take stems as if they were instruments, and then creating, let's say, the spectral and pitch analysis per stem to try to understand to what extent a fixed pitch center will be useful, so really play things as if they were keyboard adaptable, or if things are more free and they're moving in between notes, then that gives you gives you some agency to say, well, no, this is more about the shape rather than the notes that are being played. That with Radic, for example, is very important to discern what would you want to do. You want to play the actual notes, or do you want to play with the beatings between the notes? So what is closer to the aesthetic of Radic? In the case of Bode, I think it was more about this idea of being able to generate a rhythmic line, a melodic line, and the ranges and the correspondences between them, and then the overarching, of course, this idea of the phasings of the voices, that the rhythmic line stays kind of steady, but the timbre of it is constantly changing. Here I use different tools to, after doing the separation, then I play play my own version, and I try to identify center tones, and this is done with different softwares. And in here, I went into the video and I did my best to reconstruct a setup that resembles it. So that's a lot of eBaying to get the actual, yeah, this is justified hoarding. You don't want to go to my place. Yeah, but anyway, so this is the impractical version. So with that, I made the first version of the first half, and I convinced myself that I could play it. And then the last convincing aspect was this. So, Per, you were there, no? Okay. You might agree with me that sounds very close to Phase 6. Hence the 1976. To me, Phase 6 is probably one iteration of these performances that he did with some things that were pre-recorded and things that he played on top. So the melodic line is him playing with the function generator, with the oscillator. The actual rhythm generator is an old core thing that I got for 20 minutes and it broke down. So yeah, that's what happens with these things. But anyway, it was enough to convince myself that I was in the right track. And I focused then my work by January, which is when I delivered the text about where I was twofolded. One was to be able to play the first 5 minutes of the piece, the first section, and then to expand that more in an improvisatory way. That's what I thought I will do. And then what I wanted to do was to make a comment between the then and the now. And because of my, again, this is more exposing the inner kitchen, but because of my professional pressures, of course, I had to do something with IRCAM-based software that deals with artificial intelligence. I started working with a software called DAISY2, but it's not very good for real time, so I had to cheat a lot in terms of waiting 30 seconds or a minute before something will come out. In between of that process, they came up with Somax 2, which is the newest AI thing that they're using, like kind of machine learning to improvise with yourself. So that is what I'm working on. It is not very stable, but it works if you know what you're doing and you remember the order of things. So then I built myself a rest of the map where 3 instances of Somax 2 are being intertwined. One is the result of analyzing my performance until that point. There's a clear breaking point there, which is, so to speak, the live version of the historical piece. And then the other 2 are based on not on Phase 6, but on the improvisation of the video. And the other one is on a whole hour and a half of a whole day that I was in October at the Musikhochschule. But today I realized that I should call it Hochschule für Musik. No? Sorry, I've been doing it all wrong. But where I mostly work with the works that Gerhard, reconstructions of Gerhard. So it was a set with an oscillator, a frequency shifter, a ring modulator, and 2 VCAs, and the Barberpole Phaser. And of course, me being me, it was mostly about what else can I put in the feedback loop that Gerhard was mentioning to really destroy the continuity of this nice, so make the Barberpole basically burn up. And that's turned into an hour and a half that is fed into the system to interact with the rest of the parts. I had to reduce my setup, so that's what it looks like now, and it will be hopefully working at 7 o'clock tonight. And I think I don't have time for this. This is just this is what the Barberpole Phaser sounds like when I play it. Anyway, there is some unavoidable continuity, but yeah, there you go. This is Somax 2, and the performance I leave for tonight, so you're welcome to. No, this is what will happen in June. The first part of, I'm invited to present this at the International Computer Music Conference in Boston. And I've been given the opportunity to try the first part with the original Model 12. I'm not sure how many documents I have to sign to make sure that whatever I do, I don't break it and all those things. You break, you pay. I don't think I can afford it. So if I'm never back, you know where I'm washing dishes for the rest of my life. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Some remarks.
Otherwise, we have the conversation.
Yeah, we have to get the conservation later on. So.
Hmm?
The video is 72.
72?
So it may be
Earlier, great.
Okay. Ah, yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and also maybe a bigger look at your other projects. But I was wondering, because you showed us how you use like analyzer software like Sonic Visualizer or something like this to really dig into like what is hidden beneath all the sound layers. But I was wondering, you working with electronics like all of your artistic life, isn't there also a part that is just like, I mean, it's a very like practical question, but isn't there a part that you are fumbling out just by listening? What part does listening or your bodily knowledge of electronic sounds play in reconstructing, for example, this piece?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very much. I mean, I can hear immediately, oh, this is analog or digital, or this is very warm. So either someone put a very nice tube compressor at the end, or it's a tube X. So yeah, hearing plays a role. But of course, knowing, well, 76 or 72 in this case still limits the range of, okay, these are the tools that he was using, this was present. For example, the thing that looks like a big muff on the table, that's the drum computer that he had. And it was from Korg, and it was like an OEM, so Korg produced them, but instead of like this, like the big muffs, they were shifted in 90 degrees, so it took me a long time to realize that, yeah, no, it's the same thing. They just shifted around to sell it in the US as a new tool. And the one that Harald Bode had was from the US, and then you can see from which year to what year. And then I can say, okay, then the DFAM, that is a drum computer sequencer, uses the same topology to create these particular tones, so I can use that now, and I'll be in the ballpark. That's, yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, it doesn't mean that you cannot do this in Super Collider and put 5 lines of code and generate that sequence, but you have to embrace the effect that has to what you're doing. And to my taste, there's a lot of this kind of music that without the tactility and the potential of things going wrong, they're more interesting sequence to program in Super Collider. That's what yeah.
Okay, thank you. Then Luis is up next. Thank you, Juan. Thank you.